who have filmed weddings, what's the worst thing you've caught on camera and had to edit out of the final video? Story 1. I'm a wedding videographer, and one time, I caught a cringe-worthy moment that was so awkward I almost couldn't edit it out fast enough. It was during the father-daughter dance, which is always an emotional moment, right? But this one was different. The father, who seemed to be pretty tipsy, decided it was the perfect time to make some inappropriate comments to his daughter. At first, I thought it was just a joke, but then it became more uncomfortable as he kept whispering things like, "You've grown up so beautiful, just like your mother, and you've always been my little girl, you know that, right?" It got to a point where he even kissed her on the cheek, but it was more than just a fatherly kiss. It was a little too lingering. The daughter didn't react at all, which made it worse. She looked completely uncomfortable, but tried to smile through it. My stomach dropped when I realized I had captured all of it on film. I quickly edited out the entire segment to avoid any awkwardness for the bride and her family. After the wedding, I had a conversation with the couple and subtly mentioned what I'd seen. They were completely unaware of it, which made me feel even more relieved that I'd caught it in time. Needless to say, I learned to be even more cautious about what I film at weddings after that. Story 2. I've been filming weddings for a while now, and I thought I'd seen it all until one particular wedding proved me wrong. There was a guest, let's call him Uncle Dave, who had a bit too much to drink and decided he was going to spice things up during the ceremony. As the vows were being exchanged, Uncle Dave stood up, shouted, "I object," and tried to walk toward the couple, presumably to offer some sort of unsolicited opinion. The entire room fell silent. People were staring at him, some in confusion, others in sheer disbelief. It was awkward, but what made it worse was that he went on a tirade about how he didn't think they should get married, throwing in personal details about their relationship that no one else knew. I had to stop filming for a second to make sure I didn't catch anything too inappropriate, but I did manage to get the whole exchange on tape. What made the situation even more bizarre was that the couple didn't even flinch. They just calmly continued with their vows as if nothing had happened. Thankfully, the best man and another family member managed to escort Uncle Dave out of the venue shortly after his out. I had to spend hours editing out the scene, and even though it was hilarious in hindsight, I was thankful the bride and groom hadn't seen it in real time. The footage was cut, but I'll never forget the stunned faces of the guests as Uncle Dave made his dramatic exit. Story 3. I filmed a wedding a few years ago where everything was perfect. The location, the ceremony, the couple, until the reception. The bride's cousin, a guy in his late 20s, was clearly the life of the party. But as the evening went on, his behavior got increasingly erratic. During the reception, he grabbed the microphone from the DJ to give a toast, but it quickly turned into a disaster. He was slurring his words, and it became clear he was too intoxicated to speak coherently. At first, it was just awkward, but then he started saying some seriously offensive stuff. He told a story about the bride when she was younger, something about a drunken night in college that no one, least of all the bride's new in-laws, needed to hear. To make matters worse, he began poking fun at the groom, calling him lucky to have her, but in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. I'm sitting there behind my camera thinking, do I stop filming this? Do I intervene? But I decided it was best to keep my distance and just record the moment. The family quickly realized what was happening, and the groom's brother had to intervene. They grabbed the mic from him, and security escorted him out. When I got home that night, I couldn't believe what I had captured. The awkwardness was so palpable that I debated whether or not I should even tell the couple about what happened. I ultimately decided to edit out the entire speech, leaving just the immediate aftermath for the family to process. The bride and groom thanked me afterward for not making them relive that moment in the final video, and I learned a valuable lesson. Always check the reception's open bar policy. Story 4. As a wedding videographer, I always try to be as respectful as possible, blending into the background. But there's one time I really wished I'd been invisible. At this one wedding, there was a bridesmaid who was so incredibly high on something, and it was obvious the entire time. During the ceremony, she was stumbling around, swaying on her feet, and at one point she even tripped while walking down the aisle. She was already a bit of a distraction, but things took a bizarre turn during the couple's first dance. The bridesmaid, in a fit of giggles, suddenly launched herself at the groom. She didn't hug him or anything innocent like that. No, she actually tried to kiss him, fully intending to interrupt the moment between the bride and groom. I quickly zoomed in to avoid catching too much of the scene, but it was already a train wreck in the making. The bride was furious and immediately pulled the bridesmaid away. Luckily, the couple handled it as gracefully as they could, but there was no way I could leave that moment in the video. After editing, I had to make sure the scene was completely erased from existence. When I showed the final product to the couple, they seemed unaware of the full extent of what had happened. They were thankful, but I was just relieved I'd avoided creating an even bigger mess. Story 5. I once filmed a wedding where the best man, during his speech, decided it was time to air some very personal stories about the groom. He began talking about how they used to be wild and crazy in college, and how the groom had always been a heartbreaker. But then he went a step too far. He revealed a past relationship of the groom's, where the groom had cheated on his ex-fiancée. I froze. The bride was sitting in the front row, her face turning pale as she looked at the groom for answers. The best man was oblivious, still cracking jokes and reminiscing about college antics. I quickly panned away from the groom's face to avoid any discomfort, but the damage had been done. After the speech, there was an awkward silence, followed by a tense atmosphere as everyone tried to act like nothing had happened. The groom, who had clearly been caught off guard, whispered an apology to the bride. After the wedding, I edited that entire portion of the speech out. It was a tough call, but I knew it was the right decision to protect the couple's privacy. Thankfully, the bride and groom never realized what had happened in that moment, and they loved the final video. However, I made a mental note to always be prepared for the unexpected when filming speeches. Story 6. I've been filming weddings for years, but the one that still haunts me to this day was a wedding where I captured a truly bizarre and unsettling moment. It was during the bride's entrance. Everything was perfect. The bride looked stunning. The venue was breathtaking and the music was just right. But as she started walking down the aisle, everything took a turn for the worse. The groom, who had been fine moments before, started shaking uncontrollably and collapsed in front of the altar. I initially thought it was just nerves, but then I saw him struggle to get back up. The groomsmen rushed to help and there was a sudden panic in the air. Someone shouted for water. Others were looking around frantically. Turns out, the groom had been dealing with a medical condition that none of us had known about. His blood sugar had dropped too low, and it caused him to faint. It was all incredibly dramatic, but the bride was the real hero in this moment. Instead of panicking, she stayed calm, knelt beside him, and helped him regain his composure. The ceremony was delayed for about 20 minutes while the groom recovered, and the guests were all whispering amongst themselves, trying to figure out what happened. The bride didn't even leave his side. I had to edit out the moments where he fainted to avoid making the entire situation seem like it was part of the ceremony. There were some awkward camera angles, but I focused on keeping things respectful and uplifting. In the end, the ceremony went on, and the groom was able to stand on his own. They were married in front of all their loved ones, but there's no denying that it was a pretty wild start to their wedding. I kept a copy of the footage, but the final video was edited to keep that moment private. I really feel for the groom and bride, but in a way, it just added to the uniqueness of their wedding. Story 7. I filmed a wedding at a beautiful vineyard in Napa, and everything was going smoothly until the reception. There was a lovely outdoor space where people were dancing and enjoying drinks, and the vibe was just what you'd expect, charming and joyful. But then came the father of the bride's speech. Now, this guy was clearly trying to be funny, but his timing was off. As he started his speech, he made a few lighthearted jokes about the groom, which were typical for a father of the bride toast. But then, out of nowhere, he started talking about the bride's ex-boyfriend, mentioning how he wasn't as good-looking as the groom and making inappropriate comments about how he wasn't a real man. The entire room went silent. The bride looked mortified, and I could see the groom getting more and more uncomfortable. As he continued, it became painfully clear that he wasn't just reminiscing about the past. He was comparing the groom to the ex in a very awkward, almost spiteful way. At this point, the bride was visibly upset, and I was desperately trying to figure out what to do. I had to keep filming, but I could see that this speech was going to be a huge issue. Finally, the best man stepped in and politely took the mic from the father, giving an impromptu speech to diffuse the situation. Afterward, the bride took a moment to compose herself, and the father seemed to realize his mistake. But that awkward tension stayed in the air for the rest of the reception. Editing out the entire father's speech was my only option, as I didn't want to add any fuel to the fire for the couple. I had to piece together a seamless moment where everyone was laughing and happy, and the footage of the bride crying in the corner didn't make the final cut. I reached out to the couple afterward to apologize for the discomfort, and they were incredibly understanding. However, to this day, it was one of the most cringeworthy moments I've witnessed while filming a wedding. Story 8. A few months ago, I filmed a wedding where, despite all the gorgeous details, the one thing that made this wedding stand out was the absolute chaos at the reception. It started innocently enough. The couple had a beautiful first dance and guests were mingling, laughing, and enjoying themselves. But then, at some point during the night, a few guests began getting rowdy. A particularly lively group of college friends of the groom had clearly been drinking a bit too much, and that's when things started to spiral. They insisted on performing a funny skit about the groom's bachelor party, which was mostly just a series of crude jokes, references to wild partying, and too many details about what went down. They even pulled the groom into the act, making him stand up and reenact some of the wilder moments. It went from bad to worse when one of the groomsmen yelled, "Let's get him naked, he's too decent for this crowd." And just like that, they tried to pull the groom's shirt off. Fortunately, the groom quickly stopped them, but the damage had already been done. Several guests were visibly uncomfortable, and the bride, who had been dancing with her friends, looked horrified. I kept my camera rolling, trying to capture the wild energy of the moment for the final video, but once I saw the bride's reaction, I knew I had to do some serious editing. The groom's friends were loud and out of control, and it wasn't the kind of fun I wanted to memorialize for the couple. I ended up cutting out almost the entire segment, leaving only a few moments of guests laughing and dancing. When I delivered the final video, the couple seemed thrilled, and I could tell they were grateful I didn't include the chaos. To this day, I still feel a little guilty for even filming it. But in hindsight, I know it was the right call to cut the worst moments. Story 9. I'll never forget the wedding where I had to edit out a truly bizarre moment involving the flower. The wedding itself was lovely, with beautiful decor, a serene outdoor ceremony, and a couple that was clearly in love. However, the flower girl, who was about 5 or 6 years old, decided to take matters into her own hands. During the ceremony, as she was walking down the aisle, she suddenly stopped, turned around, and began yelling at the guests. It wasn't anything cute, like calling out to her parents. No, she was demanding that everyone clap and cheer for her because she was the most important person here. The flower girl then proceeded to refuse to throw any petals, insisting instead that everyone pay attention to her and her fancy dress. The poor bridesmaids and groomsmen had no idea how to react. The bride and groom were trying not to laugh, but I could tell they were both feeling incredibly awkward. The moment stretched on for several minutes, and it became a spectacle as the little girl argued with the officiant, demanding more attention. I quickly cut away from the scene, trying to keep the camera on the bride and groom's reaction, but it was so disruptive that it took a lot of work to hide the awkwardness. I had to edit out the entire scene of the flower girl's meltdown, and while it did add an unexpected layer of chaos to the ceremony, I'm sure the bride and groom would have preferred to forget it. After all, their wedding was meant to be about them, not a temper tantrum from a child. Story 10. One of the most shocking moments I've ever filmed occurred at a wedding where a fight broke out during the reception. The bride and groom had hired a professional wedding planner, and everything seemed to be going according to plan. However, things got out of hand after the dinner was served. A couple of guests, who were distant relatives of the groom, had clearly been feuding for years, but no one thought they would actually escalate it at the wedding. One of them had too much to drink and started arguing loudly with the other about an old family dispute. It quickly became heated, with the two yelling back and forth at each other. Then, in an absolutely jaw-dropping moment, one of them threw a glass of wine at the other, and it shattered everywhere. I was filming the dance floor at the time, so I had to quickly switch cameras to catch the aftermath of the altercation. The situation escalated even further when the groomsman tried to intervene and was punched in the face. Security had to step in, and the entire situation was chaotic. I didn't know whether I should keep filming or intervene, but I decided to focus on getting the best footage of what happened next. The aftermath of the fight was more awkward than anything. The groom and his family were embarrassed, and the bride was in shock. In the final edit, I had to remove all the footage of the fight to ensure the couple could look back on their day with happy memories. However, there were still moments of tension I couldn't completely erase. It was a sad reminder that no matter how much you plan, there's always the possibility that something out of your control can take over and throw everything into chaos. Story 11. I've been filming weddings for a long time, but one event sticks out more than any other. It was a wedding where I managed to capture a truly dramatic moment. The ceremony had gone smoothly, and everything seemed picture perfect. But as the bride and groom exchanged vows, something incredibly unexpected happened. The groom's ex-girlfriend, who had been invited as a family friend, suddenly stood up and walked to the front. She didn't say a word at first, but everyone could feel the tension rising as she approached the couple. She then looked directly at the bride and said, "I still love him, and I think you're making a mistake." The room went silent, and I immediately zoomed in on the bride, who was looking absolutely mortified. The groom's face was pale, and it was clear that he hadn't expected this at all. The ex then tried to make her case by listing all the reasons she thought the groom was still in love with her. She even brought up private memories they'd shared from their past relationship. The bride stood there for a moment, completely still, before saying to the ex, "You're wrong. He loves me, and we're getting married today. Please leave." There was a tense silence, and after a few awkward moments, the ex-girlfriend reluctantly walked out. Everyone was in shock, including me. I had captured it all on film, but after a few minutes of thinking about it, I realized there was no way I could include such a personal and awkward confrontation in the final wedding video. The entire confrontation was edited out, and when I showed the final video to the couple, I kept things lighthearted and focused on the good parts of their day. I did mention what happened to the bride privately, and she appreciated my decision to remove that incident. It was a tough call, but I knew it was the right one to ensure the couple's big day wasn't overshadowed by a dramatic outburst. Story 12. I filmed hundreds of weddings, but there's one wedding I'll never forget, and not for the reasons you might think. It was a big, extravagant event in an elegant ballroom. Everything seemed to be going perfectly, until the bouquet toss. Usually, this part of the wedding is lighthearted and fun. The single ladies gather around, the bride throws the bouquet, and someone catches it. But at this wedding, things took an unexpected turn when one of the bridesmaids, who had been a little too enthusiastic throughout the day, got a bit too competitive during the toss. The bride threw the bouquet high into the air, and as the bridesmaids went for it, this one particular bridesmaid, let's call her Jenna, jumped in front of everyone, knocking two other women out of the way. But instead of catching the bouquet, she fell to the ground in an awkward, flailing heap. The moment was so over the top that it almost looked staged. But what made it worse was that she immediately tried to make it look like part of the act, jumping up, laughing hysterically, and claiming it was all in fun. The problem was that the bride and the other bridesmaids weren't as amused as Jenna thought. They were clearly annoyed, and the bride looked embarrassed by the scene. I kept filming because, as a videographer, I knew this could be an interesting moment to capture. But it quickly became clear that this was no longer the lighthearted moment it was supposed to be. Jenna's antics distracted everyone, and there was a noticeable tension in the air as the guests tried to figure out whether this was a joke or if something was seriously wrong. When I started editing the footage, I realized I had to cut out the entire segment. The bride was grateful when I showed her the final video, and I could tell she appreciated my effort to keep things smooth and focused on the moments she'd wanted to remember. It's safe to say that Jenna learned a lesson about taking things too far at weddings. Story 13. As a wedding videographer, you get used to the chaos and unpredictability that can happen on a wedding day. But there was one wedding where I caught something that was completely unexpected, and it wasn't even related to any of the typical wedding drama. The couple had chosen a scenic lakeside venue for their ceremony, with the beautiful natural backdrop and the gentle sound of the water in the background. The ceremony was flawless, and the couple looked incredibly happy. However, when it came time for the reception, something went terribly wrong. The couple had arranged for a surprise firework display to take place later in the evening. But it wasn't until the fireworks began that I realized how badly things could go. A group of younger guests, all in their late teens or early 20s, had clearly had a little too much to drink, and one of them, trying to show off for his friends, snuck away from the crowd and ran toward the fireworks setup. What followed next could only be described as a disaster. This kid, let's call him Tom, had no idea what he was doing. He tried to light one of the fireworks early, and instead of setting it off as intended, he caused a massive misfire that sent sparks and flames flying into the crowd. The area around the fireworks setup was immediately evacuated, and panic spread through the guests. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but the entire event was halted for about an hour, while fire marshals dealt with the situation. I had to work quickly to edit out the footage of the fire and the chaos that followed. It was heartbreaking because the couple had hoped to have a beautiful fireworks show to end their night, but instead, it became a major safety issue. Afterward, I made sure to cut down the footage of the panicked guests and focus on the more positive aspects of the evening. The couple was thankful for my discretion in edit, and I learned to always be prepared for the unexpected, especially when fireworks are involved. Story 14. One of the most nerve-wracking moments I've ever experienced as a wedding videographer happened during a wedding where I thought everything was going perfectly, until it wasn't. The bride was an absolute vision in her wedding dress, and the groom looked so happy as he stood at the altar. The ceremony was flawless, and there was a moment during the vows when the couple exchanged personal, heartfelt promises to each other. It was beautiful. However, just as they were about to share their first kiss, something completely out of the blue happened. A loud, intrusive sound echoed through the ceremony, an air horn. The groom, who was about to lean in to kiss his bride, jumped back in surprise. The sound had come from one of the guests, who had been sitting at the back of the ceremony space, and apparently thought it was funny to disrupt the moment. The bride was shocked, the groom was startled, and the entire crowd went silent. I was mortified. How could someone do that during such a significant moment? The bride and groom gave the guest a look that could freeze water, and the officiant quickly moved on to avoid further disruption. As I continued filming, I could see the awkwardness lingering in the air. When I started editing, I had a tough choice to make. The air horn moment was unavoidable. It had happened in real time, but I couldn't allow such a disruptive moment to dominate the video. I edited the moment out, making sure the first kiss was as beautiful and serene as the couple had originally intended. When I handed the video over, the couple thanked me for capturing their day perfect. I don't think they ever found out about the air horn incident, and I was happy to keep that particular detail off their wedding video. Story 15. I was hired to film a wedding that was taking place in a charming church on a rainy afternoon. The ceremony was small but intimate, with just close family and friends present. The bride's dress was absolutely stunning, and the groom looked proud as he waited for her at the altar. Everything was perfect until the ring exchange. The groom, who had been a little nervous throughout the ceremony, fumbled with the ring box as he tried to open it. It was the kind of thing you can imagine happening to anyone, but what made it unforgettable was that, instead of just fumbling and recovering, the groom accidentally dropped the entire ring box onto the floor. What happened next was even more surreal. The ring box popped open as it hit the floor, and the wedding ring flew across the church aisle and rolled underneath the pews. The bride gasped, and the entire congregation looked around in confusion. For a moment, no one moved. It was like a scene from a comedy movie. The groom's face turned bright red as he frantically tried to retrieve the ring, but it took a full minute before he found it. I captured the entire incident on film, but once I began editing the footage, I realized that this could be an awkward moment if left in. I edited it so that the moment was as quick and seamless as possible, cutting out some of the more drawn-out awkwardness. In the final video, it looked like a minor hiccup, and the couple never had to relive the embarrassment of the ring flying across the church. It became a funny story for them to tell their friends, but I'm sure glad they didn't see the footage during the ceremony. Story 16. I was filming a wedding last summer that was taking place at a gorgeous lakeside venue. The weather was perfect, and the ceremony was going smooth. The bride looked stunning, and the groom was beaming with happiness. However, the one moment that really stuck with me happened during the reception when the groom's uncle, let's call him Rick, decided it was time to deliver a speech. At first, his speech started off fine. He shared some heartfelt words about the groom and how proud he was of it. But then, out of nowhere, Rick started reminiscing about the groom's wild college days, which included a story about an unfortunate incident involving a traffic cone and the campus police. It wasn't exactly the most appropriate story for a wedding toast, but it was lighthearted, so the guests chuckled. Then Rick went a little too far. He began to make fun of the bride, joking about how lucky the groom was to end up with someone like her, implying that he didn't deserve her. It wasn't mean-spirited, but it was definitely uncomfortable. The bride's face was turning bright red, and the groom looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. I quickly panned away from the awkwardness, but the tension in the room was palpable. The guests were politely laughing, but the mood had clearly shifted. After the speech, the bride pulled the groom aside, and I could see them having a brief, intense conversation. Thankfully, the night continued without incident, but I couldn't help but feel for the bride. When I started editing the video, I realized I had to remove almost all of Rick's speech. It wasn't appropriate for the video, and I knew it would just be uncomfortable to watch later. After I delivered the final version of the video to the couple, they expressed how much they appreciated that I kept the moment light and omitted any of the more awkward parts. I felt relieved that I'd made the right call, but I couldn't help but shake my head at how one uncle's well-meaning speech could have turned the day into a cringe fest. Story 17. I filmed a wedding a while ago that still stands out as one of the most memorable and stressful weddings I've ever worked on. It was a beautiful outdoor ceremony at a historical venue with sprawling gardens. The bride and groom were so in love, and everything was coming together perfectly until the reception. That's when things took a strange turn. After dinner, the couple had planned a surprise for their guests, a choreographed dance. The bride and groom, along with their wedding party, had practiced for weeks, and they were excited to share it. The guests were all gathered around, waiting to see what was coming. The music began, and the dance started off great. The bride and groom were in sync, and the whole wedding party looked like they were having a blast. But just as things were getting into the groove, the groom's mother, who had been drinking quite a bit, suddenly stepped onto the dance floor and tried to join in. No one expected it, least of all the couple. She awkwardly stumbled into the center of the group, completely out of rhythm, and started pulling people in for awkward hugs and twirls. The groom and bride exchanged uncomfortable glances, but his mother didn't seem to notice how much she was throwing off the flow of the performance. The music continued, and she started dancing in the most bizarre way, flailing her arms and giggling loudly. The entire crowd, including the couple, was stuck in this tense situation, unsure whether to laugh or to step in and stop the scene. I couldn't keep the camera on the groom's mother too long, but I still caught some of the chaos. As I was editing, I realized I had to remove most of the dancing footage. It wasn't just embarrassing for the bride and groom, it was uncomfortable for everyone watching. When I handed over the final video, the couple thanked me, and I'm fairly certain they were relieved that I'd edited out the unexpected mother of the groom fiasco. In hindsight, it was definitely a moment that added some unintentional chaos to the night, but I knew I had to keep things classy in the final product. Story 18. One wedding I filmed took place in a beautiful barn venue, and everything about the day was idyllic. The setting, the couple, the guests. That was until the bouquet toss. It's a tradition, right? The bride tosses her bouquet, and whoever catches it is next in line for marriage. Typically, it's a fun moment. Everyone gathers and the bride makes her toss. Well, at this particular wedding, the bride had a younger cousin, let's call her Kayla, who was around 12 years old. Kayla was extremely competitive and, let's just say, not shy at all. When the bride tossed the bouquet into the air, it looked like everyone was going for it. However, Kayla, who had been a little too excited about the entire thing, decided to make a dramatic move. She reached out with both hands, practically launched herself at the other women, and ended up pushing a few of them to the floor in the process. What happened next was even more shocking. Kayla managed to catch the bouquet, but not without a loud, triumphant yell of, "I'm getting married next," as she stood above the other girls who were now on the ground. The entire room was stunned. Some guests started to laugh. Others seemed awkwardly unsure of how to react. The bride, who was still standing in the center of the room, looked absolutely mortified. I caught all of it on camera. The chaos, the fall, the loud exclamation. But when I was editing the video, I realized that it was such a spectacle that it would have made the entire video feel off-tone for the couple. I decided to cut out most of Kayla's dramatic victory and leave just a quick, lighthearted shot of her holding the bouquet to avoid drawing attention to her aggressive antics. When I showed the final video to the bride and groom, they were both laughing, but I could tell they were relieved that I didn't make Kayla's moment the highlight of the bouquet toss. It was a bit of a chaotic scene, but I guess the family will have that memory to laugh about for years to come. Story 19. One of the more intense weddings I filmed happened in a beautiful church, and it was the kind of ceremony that felt so romantic and sincere. The bride and groom were clearly in love and their vows were tear-jerking. But it was the groom's father, let's call him Carl, that nearly stole the show in the worst possible way. Carl had been drinking before the ceremony, and by the time he stood up to give his speech, it was clear that he wasn't entirely sober. The first half of his speech was filled with the usual, "I'm proud of you," and "welcome to the family" sentiments. But then it took a turn. Carl started going on about how he had been waiting for this day for years, and that he had been praying for his son to find a woman like the bride. That would have been fine, but Carl then proceeded to say that he always thought the groom would settle down with someone who would really keep him in line. At that point, you could see the bride's face fall and the groom looked embarrassed. But Carl wasn't done. He then made a joke about how his son had never been good at sticking to things, implying that the groom was a bit of a commitment phobe. The whole room grew tense, and I could see the bride trying not to show her discomfort, though she was clearly upset. It got worse when Carl then made a rather inappropriate comment about the groom's ex-girlfriends, making it clear that the bride wasn't his first serious relationship. It was awkward for everyone in the room, and I knew I couldn't leave any of that in the video. When I started editing the speech, I knew I had to cut most of it out. I left in the first part, which was sweet and heartfelt, but the rest? Gone. The couple was grateful when they saw the final video, and they never once mentioned Carl's speech again. I'm sure they were happy to move on from that uncomfortable moment, and I'm just glad I was able to help them focus on the happy parts of their day instead. Story 20. I was filming a wedding a couple of years ago at a beautiful vineyard with a rustic feel. The bride and groom had spent so much time making sure every detail was perfect. The ceremony was flawless. The vows were emotional, and everything was going according to plan until the reception. As the couple and their guests were enjoying dinner, a particular guest, let's call him Kevin, decided to get a little too comfortable. Kevin was an old friend of the groom, and he had a history of being the life of the party. Unfortunately, at this wedding, his life of the party attitude didn't mix well with the alcohol. Kevin, after having a few too many drinks, made his way up to the microphone during the toasts. Everyone thought he was just going to say a few words of congratulations, but what followed was an entire speech about how he thought the bride and groom were perfectly matched because they were both as messy as he was. He then proceeded to tell a story about the groom in college, one that included some highly embarrassing details, and the room went from quiet to uncomfortable real quick. The bride turned bright red, the groom looked horrified, and the rest of the guests were unsure of how to react. Kevin, clearly oblivious to the discomfort he was causing, kept talking about the groom's party days, and even cracked a joke about how he thought the bride was settling for the groom. I had to act fast. I turned my camera away from Kevin as he rambled on and tried to focus on the reactions of the bride and groom. When it was all over, I knew that I had to cut out most of what Kevin had said. It wasn't just awkward, it was uncomfortable for everyone in the room. When the couple watched the final video, they seemed to enjoy it and were grateful for how I had handled Kevin's speech. In the end, they moved on from that awkward moment, and I was glad I could give them a wedding video they could be proud of. Story 21. I filmed a wedding a few months ago that, on the surface, seemed like a perfect event. Until the bouquet toss. The ceremony had gone off without a hitch. The bride was glowing, and everything was set for a wonderful evening of celebration. The couple had hired a well-known DJ for the reception, and he was great at getting the crowd pumped. As the night went on, the party started to pick up, and it was time for the bouquet toss. The bride, who was really excited about this moment, called all the single women to gather around. As the music played, the bride tossed the bouquet into the air, and a few of the guests reached, but one woman, who was a close friend of the groom, took it a step too far. Let's call her Sarah. She had clearly had one too many drinks, and when she jumped for the bouquet, she knocked a few women out of the way, elbowing one in the face. The poor woman who got elbowed stumbled backward, and Sarah landed hard on the floor. It wasn't a graceful fall. It was a full-on faceplant. The room went silent for a moment as everyone tried to process what had just happened. The bride looked horrified, and the groom's face went pale. Sarah, not realizing the gravity of the situation, got up, dusted herself off, and proudly held the bouquet up to show she'd won. The guests awkwardly clapped, but the tension in the air was thick. As I was filming, I quickly zoomed in on the bride's face, who was trying to hold back tears, clearly embarrassed by Sarah's antics. Once the reception continued, I decided to get some good shots of the bride and groom's first dance, but the awkwardness from the bouquet toss lingered in the air. After the wedding, when I started editing the video, I knew I had to cut out Sarah's entire victory moment. It wasn't just the fall, but the fact that she had caused a disruption with her behavior. I kept the footage of the guests cheering and clapping as a way to cover up the awkwardness. When I gave the couple the final video, they were thrilled with how it turned out and didn't seem to notice what had happened during the toss, which I think was for the best. Story 22. I was filming a wedding in a beautiful cathedral, and everything about the ceremony was breathtaking until the vows. The couple was about to exchange their vows, and the atmosphere was filled with love and emotion. The groom was standing, his hands trembling slightly, waiting for his bride. The bride entered, and everyone gasped at how stunning she looked. The ceremony was about to be the perfect moment, until the bride's brother, who was also serving as the best man, decided he had something else in mind. For some context, the groom's family and the bride's brother didn't exactly get along. There was a long-standing tension between the families, and no one expected it to surface at the wedding. However, just as the bride and groom were about to exchange their vows, the best man stood up and cleared his throat, seemingly ready to speak. What followed was the most uncomfortable and inappropriate speech I've ever witnessed. Instead of a heartfelt message about the couple, the best man started making passive-aggressive comments about the groom's background. He mentioned, without warning, how the groom had never quite fit in with the family, and even joked that the bride's family had been more supportive of the relationship than the groom's side. It was jarring and completely out of place at such a pivotal moment. The bride froze, and I could see the groom's face turning red with embarrassment. The tension in the room was unbearable as the best man rambled on, making more hurtful comments about the groom's job and his past relationships. Finally, the officiant had to step in and ask the best man to sit down, which thankfully put an end to the speech. I was still filming at this point, but I could feel the weight of the moment. The bride and groom didn't say anything publicly, but I knew they were both devastated by the scene. When I started editing, I realized I had to cut the best man's speech out completely. There was no way I could leave any of that in the final video, especially knowing how much it would hurt the couple later on. When I showed them the video, they were ecstatic, and they never mentioned anything about the awkward speech. It's a reminder that weddings can be full of unexpected emotions, and it's our job to capture the good moments while minimizing the ones that could bring discomfort. Story 23. Filming weddings means you're bound to witness some unexpected moments. And one wedding I filmed stands out because of what happened just before the couple's first kiss. The ceremony had been flawless up until that point. The guests were smiling. The vows had been exchanged, and the couple was beaming at each other. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and it was time for the first kiss. However, just before the bride and groom leaned in to kiss, a loud, intrusive sneeze echoed through the church. It was a simple enough thing, a sneeze. But it wasn't just any sneeze, it was a massive sneeze from the back of the church. I turned to look, and it was the groom's elderly aunt who had been sitting quietly up until that moment. She had apparently been holding in a sneeze for far too long and released it just at the perfect time. The force of her sneeze startled the bride, who pulled back for a moment, looking confused and a little startled. The guests started chuckling nervously, but the tension in the air was undeniable. The groom, trying to lighten the mood, turned to the bride and jokingly said, "I promise that sneeze wasn't me." The guests laughed, and the couple finally shared their first kiss. But the awkwardness lingered for a while. As I edited the footage, I debated whether or not to include the sneeze in the video. On one hand, it was a funny, human moment. But on the other hand, it had disrupted such an intimate, meaningful part of the ceremony. In the end, I chose to cut the sneeze entirely and only left in the lighthearted reaction from the groom. The couple loved the final video, and I never mentioned the sneeze to them. It was a brief, strange moment, but it didn't need to be preserved for posterity. Story 24. I've filmed hundreds of weddings, but one stands out because of what happened when the groom tried to surprise the bride during the reception. The couple had planned a grand entrance after the dinner, and the groom was excited to do something a little out of the ordinary. The plan was for him to walk in, grab the mic, and serenade his new wife. The idea was sweet and romantic. However, things went awry almost immediately. As the groom walked to the stage, he tripped over a cord from the microphone, sending it flying. His momentum carried him forward, and he stumbled, knocking over a vase on a nearby table. The vase shattered on the floor, causing a loud crash that echoed through the room. The bride, who had been excited to see the gesture, looked horrified. The guests were equally stunned, unsure of how to react. The groom, now standing there with the microphone in hand, tried to recover by laughing it off, but it was clear that the moment was lost. The guests awkwardly clapped as he continued with his song, but the charm of the surprise was gone. The bride, while trying to smile through it, clearly wasn't enjoying the scene. I filmed the entire incident, but quickly realized that I couldn't leave that moment in the video. It would have made the couple's first dance look awkward and ruined the overall tone. I edited out the whole part, including the vase shattering, and focused instead on the couple's reaction after the incident. When I showed the final video, the bride and groom were thrilled with how it turned out, and I was relieved they never had to relive the clumsy surprise. Story 25. One of the most surreal weddings I've ever filmed took place at an old mansion. The ceremony was elegant, and everything went according to plan. It was one of those weddings where you could feel the weight of tradition and history. The bride's family had a lot of old customs, and the couple had decided to go all out with every detail. But it was during the reception that something unexpected happened. The couple had hired a live band to play throughout the evening, and the dance floor was packed. Guests were dancing, laughing, and enjoying the music when suddenly, the bride's great-uncle, who had been quietly watching from the sidelines, stood up and walked toward the center of the floor. He grabbed the microphone and the guests paused to see what was going on. What happened next was shocking. The great-uncle began singing an old song, but not in a fun, entertaining way. He was incredibly off-key, and his singing was unintentionally loud and jarring. Guests tried to clap along, but it was clear that everyone was uncomfortable. The bride's face turned bright red, and the groom seemed unsure whether to join in or politely steer his uncle off the stage. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the band stepped in and gently took the microphone from the great-uncle, but the damage had already been done. The whole dance floor had gone from lively to awkward, and it took a while for the energy to come back. As I began editing the video, I debated whether to leave any of it in. In the end, I cut the entire performance out, leaving just the after-party footage. The bride and groom never mentioned it, and I'm sure they were thankful for that. While the night didn't go as planned, I knew the video needed to reflect the love and joy of the couple's day, not the cringeworthy moment that was the great-uncle's singing performance. Story 26. I was filming a beautiful wedding in a quaint little chapel that had a rustic charm, with string lights draped across the rafters and candles lining the aisle. Everything about the ceremony felt so intimate and warm. The couple had planned every detail perfectly. The bride looked stunning as she walked down the aisle, and the groom, visibly moved, had tears in his eyes. The vows were heartfelt, and the ceremony was filled with joy. But then, during the exchanging of rings, something completely unexpected happened that changed the entire mood of the event. The bride and groom had both written their vows, and everything seemed perfect, until the groom accidentally dropped the wedding ring. It wasn't just a small fumble. The ring bounced once and then rolled under the pews. There was a moment of stunned silence. The officiant and the bride's father both looked at each other in panic as the groom tried to kneel down to find the ring. But the pews were tightly packed, and it wasn't an easy task to retrieve it. The groom, now flustered, asked for help, and the officiant, trying to keep things moving, awkwardly suggested that they just move on with the ceremony. After about a minute of struggling to get the ring, the groom finally managed to retrieve it with the help of the best man. The guests, realizing the awkwardness of the moment, started chuckling nervously. The bride, trying to keep the mood light, joked, "Well, I guess this is a sign we need to take our time with this marriage." The laughter from the crowd helped break the tension, and the ceremony continued. When it came time to edit the video, I knew I couldn't leave the entire ring fiasco in, especially considering the awkward struggle and how long it took to retrieve the ring. I decided to cut most of that part out, keeping just a brief moment of the couple laughing about it after. The couple never knew the extent of the mishap I had filmed. I kept the video smooth and seamless, and when they watched the final version, they were thrilled. They laughed about it, but were grateful I didn't highlight that moment for them. It's one of those things that could have become a permanent part of their wedding memory, but in the end, the edited version made their special day feel more polished.